Dear learners, welcome back to WSE True Stories, where English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. Today, we begin a journey not just through time, but through the very limits of the human spirit. It's a story that will stir your soul and sharpen your English, but even more, it will awaken a quiet courage within you. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a world without sound. No birdsong, no music, not even the gentle voice of a mother calling your name. Now imagine a world without sight. No faces, no colors, no written word, only shadows and touch. Now, imagine both. You are locked in silence and darkness, as a child. No words. No light. No way to say, I'm hungry, I'm afraid, or I love you. That was the world Helen Keller was born into. And yet, from that world, she rose to become one of the most inspiring voices of the 20th century. Not only did she learn to speak and write, she ignited movements, challenged prejudice, and lit the path for generations to come. This is not just a story. It is a resurrection. A triumph over silence, over despair, over every wall the world can build around a soul. Get ready for the most powerful and motivational story of triumph you've ever heard. Let's start the journey of Helen Keller. It all began in Tuscumbia, Alabama, a small, warm town wrapped in green hills and gentle southern skies. It was June 27, 1880, when Helen Adams Keller was born into a well-off family steeped in Southern tradition. Her father, Arthur Keller, was a former Confederate officer and editor of the local newspaper. A man of discipline, pride, and old-world manners. Her mother, Kate Keller, was a younger, thoughtful woman, patient and kind, with a deep thirst for books and culture. Though society at the time still placed women and children in quiet corners of history, Helen's arrival brought joy and laughter into the family's old plantation home, Ivy Green. At birth, she was like any other child, bright-eyed, responsive, and full of vitality. Her first year was marked by giggles, small footsteps, and the hopeful dreams of new parents. But fate had other plans. In February of 1882, when Helen was just 19 months old, she was struck by an illness, most likely scarlet fever or meningitis. The fever raged. Her small body trembled. And when it broke, Helen had survived, but not unscathed. The illness had left her both blind and deaf. In an instant, the world had closed in around her. At first, her parents clung to hope. Maybe her sight would return, or perhaps her hearing would recover. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into long, anxious months, reality hardened like ice. Helen no longer responded to sounds. Her eyes, once so lively, no longer followed light. She had vanished into a world beyond reach. What followed was not just the loss of senses, but the loss of connection, of language. Without hearing, she could not learn to speak. Without vision, she could not see signs or letters. Without language, there could be no thought, no communication. Her inner world became a storm of emotions, frustration, confusion, loneliness. She began to lash out, kicking and screaming, throwing objects, and even hitting those around her. She was not a monster. She was a prisoner inside her own mind. Her parents, overwhelmed and aching with helplessness, tried every means within their grasp. They consulted doctors, healers, and even Alexander Graham Bell, the famed inventor, who suggested they contact the Perkins Institute for the Blind. That single suggestion would become the hinge upon which Helen's entire life would turn. But for now, Helen's world remained wild and wordless. She developed crude signs with her friend Martha, the cook's daughter, such as pulling to indicate go or shaking to mean no, but these were limited. There was no structure, no bridge to complex thought. Her family, desperate to soothe her, often gave into her tantrums, unintentionally encouraging her sense of chaos and entitlement. She was brilliant, but trapped. By the age of 6, Helen Keller had become a figure of pity and mystery. Outsiders spoke in hushed tones. Some even said she should be institutionalized. Others thought her mind was gone. But behind those silent eyes and ears, something fierce and intelligent was watching, waiting, burning. A mind not broken, but unspeakably isolated. And then, the knock came at the door. Her name was Sullivan. A young woman of 20, herself partially blind, shaped by hardship and hunger. Orphaned, sickly, and once nearly forgotten in an almshouse, and had clawed her way through the Perkins Institute, graduating as valedictorian. But she was not just educated. She was forged in fire. She knew suffering. She knew darkness. And she knew that Helen Keller wasn't unreachable, just unreached. When Anne arrived at Ivy Green in March of 1887, she found not a monster, but a child drowning. In her very first days, Anne insisted on discipline, a concept Helen had never encountered. She moved Helen into a small cottage on the property to create routine and focus. She began teaching her sign language by spelling words into Helen's hand, starting with DOLL and CAKE. But Helen didn't understand. She memorized the finger patterns but didn't yet grasp that they represented ideas, things, symbols. Helen was imitating, but not communicating. Then came a moment, one of the most famous turning points in educational history, that changed everything. It happened at the water pump. Anne had taken Helen outside and began pumping water over her hand. With her other hand, she spelled WATR over and over again into Helen's palm. Suddenly, like a lightning bolt across the sky, understanding struck. Helen stopped. She dropped the mug. She stood still. Then she touched the pump and asked for its name. And spelled it. Then the ground. Then her dress. Then Anne herself. Helen had discovered language. Not the mechanical imitation of signs, but the connection between symbol and meaning, the key that opened the door to human thought. By nightfall, she had learned 30 new words. But that was only the beginning. Helen had touched the key, yes, but the house of knowledge was vast, and her journey through it would test every limit of will, patience, and strength. Ahead of her lay even greater battles, to speak, to read, to be accepted by a society that rarely embraced those who were different. A new world had opened, but it was also a world with rules, prejudice, and barriers. And Helen was determined to climb through them all. In the next part, we will follow Helen and Anne as they embark on the first real leg of their journey, against doubt, against systems, and even against each other. The bond that would make history had only just begun, and it would be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The pump scene had changed everything, not just for Helen, but for Anne as well. From that day forward, the small cottage behind Ivy Green became more than a school. It became a battleground, where chaos and discipline clashed, where frustration met love, and where every lesson was a duel between the wild and the awakened. Helen's thirst for knowledge was now relentless. She wanted to name everything, touch everything, understand it all. She would run her hands over flowers, furniture, people's faces, always asking, "What is this?" She would spell the words into her own palm, forming mental pictures as she did. the world was no longer silent or shapeless. It was a symphony of textures and meanings. Anne, her guide and guardian, fed this hunger with patience and strength. But learning wasn't just about naming things. It was about discipline. Helen still had deep habits of entitlement. She wanted her way, all the time. Anne, who believed that character was more important than comfort, refused to bend. She corrected Helen's behavior firmly, even at the cost of her affection. At times, they clashed, Helen kicking, biting, shrieking in rage. But Anne never yielded to pity. She loved Helen, not with softness, but with purpose. Soon, Helen was introduced to Braille, the raised dot writing system for the blind. Her fingers learned to dance across the pages, reading faster than many-sighted children. She also began to study arithmetic by counting beads, history through stories, and nature by exploring the world around her, all with Anne's hands always nearby, always spelling. But language alone wasn't enough. Helen wanted to speak. This was perhaps the most heartbreaking desire of all. Speaking was the one thing Anne couldn't give her. At least, not easily. They tried, endlessly, with Helen placing her fingers on Anne's lips and throat, trying to imitate sounds, shaping breath into meaning. But her voice came out strangled, raw, incomprehensible. Again and again, Helen would try, and again, she would fail. And still, she did not stop. As Helen's education advanced, so did her fame. Word spread about the miracle child, blind, deaf, but learning. Visitors arrived at Ivy Green, reporters wrote articles, and soon, Helen and Anne were invited to visit Boston, the very place where Anne had found her own salvation. At the Perkins Institute for the Blind, Helen was exposed to a wider world of tools, teachers, and students. For the first time, she met other blind and deaf children, and saw that she was not alone. She touched the bust of Homer. She read the lives of heroes. And she visited the seaside, feeling the vastness of the ocean in her chest. As she wrote later, "My soul was full of longing, and I seemed to hear the call of the sea." In Boston, Helen also met a young inventor and telephone pioneer, Alexander Graham Bell, who had first connected her family to Anne. He became a lifelong friend and mentor. But not everyone welcomed Helen's growing visibility. Some questioned whether she truly understood what she was learning. A few accused Anne of coaching her too closely, of manipulating responses for fame. The scrutiny was relentless. But none of it mattered to Helen. Her mind was focused on college. Yes, college. That word, impossible for most deaf-blind children in the 1800s, became her new dream. She wanted to attend Harvard's sister institution, Radcliffe College, and be the first deaf-blind person to earn a degree. It was an outrageous goal. The entrance exams alone required years of study. Helen would need to master Latin, German, English literature, advanced math, and more, all without seeing or hearing. No accessible formats. No accommodations. And would need to spell every word of every lecture, book, and conversation into Helen's palm, hours and hours a day. And yet, they began. Helen hired tutors and copied textbooks into Braille by hand. They studied from dawn until midnight, memorizing facts, dissecting grammar, writing essays. Often, Anne collapsed from exhaustion. Her health wavered. She had sacrificed everything, her youth, her strength, her personal life, for Helen's education. But Anne never stopped. In 1899, at the age of 19, Helen sat for the Radcliffe entrance exam. The logistics were brutal. Each exam had to be read letter by letter into her hand, her answers spelled back out, and then transcribed for the faculty. It took double the time, triple the effort. When the results came in, she had passed. She had done it. Helen Keller, once a raging, unreachable child, had conquered the gates of academia. In 1900, she entered Radcliffe as a freshman. But college was no fairy tale. There was no Braille library, no interpreters, no recorded lectures. Every piece of knowledge had to go through Anne's fingers. In crowded lecture halls, Anne would sit beside Helen, listening and spelling the professor's every word into her palm. Sometimes the speed was too fast. Sometimes the fatigue was too much. And Anne, already strained, began to follow more often. Helen, meanwhile, struggled with loneliness. She could not join in student conversations. She could not attend social events. She was surrounded by minds, but isolated from voices. Even among hundreds, she was often alone. Yet, the pain fueled her passion. In those years, Helen developed a deep connection to literature and philosophy. She read the works of Plato, Kant, Shakespeare, and Marcus Aurelius. She found in their writings the same questions she wrestled with. What is the purpose of suffering? What gives life meaning? Is knowledge enough, or must we also act? These questions awakened something new in her, not just a desire to learn, but a desire to lead. But this inner fire would soon be tested, more than ever before. During her college years, Helen began to write publicly. Essays, articles, even her first autobiography titled The Story of My Life. It was a sensation. People were fascinated by her mind, her eloquence, her story. But the attention also brought new conflict. Helen started speaking out, not just about disability, but about poverty, workers' rights, and inequality. She joined the Socialist Party, supported labor unions, and criticized capitalism. Newspapers that once praised her now turned against her. They called her misled, naive, and accused her of being a puppet. She's blind and deaf, they said. How can she possibly understand politics? To which Helen responded, I have felt it on my skin. I have heard it in the silence of empty stomachs. I do not need eyes to see injustice. This was her turning point, the moment when Helen Keller stopped being a symbol and became a force. But becoming a force had its price. She lost friendships. She faced public attacks. Donors who supported her education withdrew their money. Radcliffe distanced itself. Even some disability advocates grew uncomfortable with her political outspokenness. Anne, too, was overwhelmed. Her health deteriorated. She felt torn between supporting Helen's independence and protecting her from the consequences of boldness. For the first time, the bond between them grew strained. Anne, who had always been the voice of restraint and stability, now watched Helen walk into storms that might destroy everything they had built. And yet, Helen could not turn back. I cannot help but speak, she wrote. Silence is the lie that lets tyranny breathe. The climax of conflict was not a single moment, but a gradual reckoning. Helen Keller, once a silent child, had found her voice, but that voice was now shaking the very foundations of polite society. She had defied the odds to learn. Now she would defy the world to fight for others. Would the world accept her as more than an icon of personal inspiration? Would they allow a deaf-blind woman to be a radical thinker? A social leader? A voice of revolution? That was the war Helen now waged, no longer against her own limitations, but against the limitations society tried to place upon her. And as we'll see in the next chapter, Helen Keller would not only overcome. She would rise, higher, louder, and more powerfully than anyone ever imagined. Because the time had come, not just to be heard, but to lead. Helen Keller stepped out of college not just with a degree, but with a mission. She had defied every expectation, becoming the first deaf-blind person to graduate with honors from Radcliffe College in 1904, but she never saw that as the end. For Helen, it was the beginning of a deeper journey, a calling beyond personal triumph. She had built a mind, now she wanted to build a better world. With Sullivan still by her side, Helen began a new chapter as a writer, speaker, and activist. She published her autobiography, The Story of My Life, which became an instant classic, translated into dozens of languages. People all over the world read the pages she had dictated through touch, and for the first time, they understood the courage behind the silence. Helen quickly became a sought-after speaker, not for sympathy, but for wisdom. She traveled across the United States and Europe, delivering lectures with the help of an interpreter, and would speak aloud the words that Helen spelled into her palm. At times, they stood on stage together for hours, inspiring audiences in packed halls and crowded city squares. And the message Helen shared was not simple or comfortable. She spoke out for women's suffrage, for the rights of the blind, and for workers struggling in poverty. She condemned child labor, military aggression, and racism. In a time when women were expected to be quiet, Helen roared. In a world that pitted the disabled, she demanded respect, not charity. She joined forces with major reformers and world leaders. She became friends with Mark Twain, who called her the eighth wonder of the world. She met Thomas Edison, who gave her a phonograph. She spoke with Winston Churchill, who admired her bravery. She visited the White House multiple times, meeting every U.S. president from Grover Cleveland to Lyndon B. Johnson. But not all welcomed her ideals. When she supported socialism, she was criticized harshly by the press. Newspapers that once hailed her as a miracle child now ridiculed her political views. Helen's beautiful mind has been twisted, they said. But Helen never backed down. She wrote, "People do not like to think. If one thinks, one must reach conclusions. Conclusions are not always pleasant." Through it all, and remained her constant, until 1936, when Sullivan passed away. The woman who had opened Helen's mind to the world, who had been her eyes, ears, voice, and companion for 50 years, was gone. Helen was devastated. For days, she withdrew from the world, and had been more than a teacher. She had been her second soul. But Helen knew and would not want her to stop. So she continued. She traveled the globe, visiting 35 countries across 5 continents. In Japan, she was treated like royalty. In India, she was revered by Mahatma Gandhi. In South Africa, she spoke out against apartheid. Wherever she went, she brought a message of hope, equality, and the power of the human spirit. She championed the rights of the disabled, especially the blind. In 1925, she addressed the Lions Club International and inspired the organization to adopt blindness prevention as one of its key missions. Her famous words at that event still echo today. "Alone we can do so little, together we can do so much." And it was never just words. Helen worked with the American Foundation for the Blind for over 40 years, raising funds, developing education programs, and pushing for better legislation. She advocated for Braille in schools, employment for the blind, and access to books and tools for those with disabilities. She wasn't satisfied until others had the same chances she had fought so hard to claim. In her later years, Helen also wrote books on philosophy, faith, and social justice. She shared her belief in the dignity of all people, regardless of class, race, gender, or ability. She believed that life, even with suffering, was a glorious opportunity. She believed that obstacles were not meant to stop us, but to shape us. And those beliefs were not just ideas. She lived them. Helen Keller, the girl once locked in silence and darkness, became a symbol of vision, not the kind measured by eyes, but the kind born of purpose. She was honored with the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964, one of the highest awards given to civilians in the United States. She was named one of the most influential people of the 20th century. Her image appeared on stamps, her name on schools and buildings, and her legacy in every campaign for disability rights around the world. When she passed away in 1968, at the age of 87, the world mourned, not just the loss of a woman, but the passing of an era. She was buried beside Sullivan, as she had always wished, in Washington, D.C.'s National Cathedral. Together, even in rest, they remained a testament to the power of courage and compassion. But Helen Keller's story was never meant to end with a tombstone. Her legacy continues, every time a blind child picks up a book, every time a voice speaks for those who are unheard, every time someone refuses to accept the limits society has placed upon them. Because Helen taught us something eternal. That even in the deepest darkness, there is a light within. That silence cannot imprison a soul unless we allow it. And that every human being, no matter how broken, forgotten, or misunderstood, has a right to belong, to dream, and to lead. So the next time life tells you, you can't. Remember the little girl who couldn't see or hear. And changed the world anyway. Dear learners, this has been the unforgettable journey of Helen Keller, a name that stands not for tragedy, but for transcendence. We hope this story touched your heart, expanded your mind, and reminded you of what truly matters. Helen's life teaches us not only about resilience, but also about revolution, of spirit, of society, and of how we see one another. If her journey inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this story with someone who needs hope. Carry her message into your own life, your community, your voice. And if you're on your own learning journey, whether it's English or something greater, let Helen remind you, there are no limits but the ones we accept. Like, comment, and subscribe to keep exploring true stories like this one, where history and humanity come alive. We have so many more tales to uncover, so many lives that can teach, stir, and ignite something new in us all. Until next time, keep learning, keep dreaming, and never stop believing in the power of your own story. Goodbye for now.